In fact, there is a moment in life when silence becomes louder than words and absence becomes heavier than presence. If you've ever wondered why someone who runs from emotional depth seems to lose themselves after betraying a deeply intuitive soul, the answer is not found in anger, it is found in understanding the soul's law of consequence. When an avoidant betrays a super empath, something unseen begins to shift, not in the world outside, but in the world within, because the empath does not react like others. They absorb, they observe, and then they release. And in that release, they take with them something the avoidant never expected: to lose emotional access to their own reflection. The truth begins with a simple realization: what you run from does not stop existing. It only waits. And the avoidant mind is built on escape, on distance, on emotional deflection. But divine law does not honor avoidance forever. It demands integration. It demands truth. And truth always finds its way back to the correct source. When betrayal enters this dynamic, it is not just an action, it is a fracture in the inner world of the one who avoids. Because deep down, they did not just lose a person. They lost a mirror that showed them who they were becoming. And when that mirror is a super empath, the reflection is not distorted. It is precise. It is pure. It is impossible to ignore forever. At first, the avoidant feels powerful, detached, free. But this is the illusion, because what they call freedom is often just disconnection from consequence. And consequence is patient. It does not rush. It arrives when distraction fades, when noise settles, when the mind is finally left alone with itself. And that is where the unraveling begins. There comes a night, sometimes weeks, sometimes months later, when silence no longer feels peaceful. It feels empty. Thoughts that were once suppressed begin to rise like tides that cannot be controlled. Memories return not as comfort, but as confrontation. The moments they did, in fact, missed. The emotions they avoided. The truth they refused to sit with. And in that inner space, something profound happens. The avoidant begins to realize that running from emotional depth did not protect them. It deprived them. It disconnected them from the very experience that gives life meaning. Genuine emotional presence. But here is the divine principle: many miss betrayal of a super empath does not destroy the empath. It isolates the betrayer from their own emotional evolution, because the empath, once detached, begins to heal and ascend. Meanwhile, the avoidant is left alone with what they created but never processed. And without integration, there is no true recovery, only cycles, only repetition, only the haunting return of unresolved emotion disguised as new situations, new people, new distractions. The avoidant cannot fully recover from this, not because they are broken beyond repair, but because recovery requires one thing they consistently resist: sitting still in emotional. Respect truth. And truth does not negotiate. It reveals. There is a deeper wisdom here. The universe does not punish through pain alone. It teaches through reflection. And when someone refuses to look inward, life eventually removes the external mirrors until they are forced to face the internal one. This is why the absence of a super empath feels different. It is not just loss. It is awakening pressure. It is the silence that exposes everything they avoided hearing when love was still present. And if they ever choose to heal, it will not come through chasing what was lost. It will come through confronting what was never understood within themselves. Because in the end, the avoidant does not suffer because they were abandoned. They suffer because they abandoned truth first. A super empath does not engage with people in the way most emotional beings do. They are not reacting from ego, insecurity, or surface-level emotional impulse. They operate from a deeper perceptual field, one that feels internal, affect intent before words are even formed, and senses emotional truth beneath every action. When an avoidant enters the life of a super empath, they initially experience something they cannot fully define. It feels safe, seen, and deeply exposing at the same time. And this is where the inner conflict begins. The super empath does not chase validation. They do not beg for clarity or force emotional availability. Instead, they reflect truth so naturally that the avoidant begins to see themselves more clearly than they are prepared for. This reflection is not harsh or manipulative, it is simply accurate. And for someone who has built their identity around emotional distance, control, and selective vulnerability, accuracy feels like pressure. Avoidant individuals often survive by managing emotional proximity. They are skilled at stepping back when things become too intimate, too real, or too demanding of internal honesty. But the presence of a super empath disrupts that pattern because the empath effect does not create chaos, they reveal it. They do not over-pursue, they observe. And in that observation, the avoidant begins to feel exposed without being attacked. What makes this dynamic so powerful is that the super empath unconsciously acts as a mirror that cannot be manipulated. The avoidant cannot charm their way out of their inconsistencies, nor can they distort perception through distance. Even silence from the super empath carries meaning. Even withdrawal from the empath is not emptiness, it is information. And this information begins to accumulate within the avoidant's subconscious mind. At first, the avoidant may interpret the empath's calmness as lack of control or emotional availability. They may even underestimate them because there is no visible emotional chasing. But over time, this absence of pursuit becomes unsettling. Because most avoidant individuals are accustomed to relationships where emotional chaos validates their withdrawal. With a super empath, there is no Kaio, effect S to blame. There is only clarity, and clarity is difficult to escape. The empath does not force self-reflection, they trigger it naturally through presence. When they listen fully. When they speak, it carries weight because it is not layered with manipulation or emotional games. This purity becomes uncomfortable for the avoidant, not because it is harmful, but because it removes excuses. It strips away the usual escape routes that allow emotional avoidance to continue unchecked. In this dynamic, even small interactions become revealing. A delayed response is not just a delay, it becomes a pattern of emotional disengagement. A half-truth is not just a statement, it becomes a reflection of internal fragmentation. And the super empath does not need to point these things out aggressively. The avoidant simply feels them being reflected back internally. This is where resistance begins. The avoidant may start to withdraw more, not because the empath is demanding, but because the effect empath is consistent in their emotional presence. Consistency is something avoidants struggle with when it requires their own emotional alignment. So instead of confronting the discomfort, they distance themselves, hoping to regain emotional control. But what they do not realize is that the super empath does not lose themselves in that distance. Their sense of self remains intact. And because of this, the reflection does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter, more internalized, and more persistent in memory. Eventually, the avoidant begins to experience a strange psychological tension. On the surface, they may feel relieved by space, but internally, something unsettles them. The absence of emotional distortion means there is nothing to project onto, no conflict to distract them, no dramatic cycle to justify avoidance, only their own inner state becoming more visible over time. This is where the super empath's influence becomes most powerful, not through presence alone, but through, in fact, the lingering clarity they leave behind. The avoidant may try to move on, but they carry the imprint of being seen without distortion. And that imprint begins to surface in moments of stillness, when distractions fade and internal awareness grows louder. They begin to question their own emotional patterns, not always consciously, but in fragmented thoughts, memories, and emotional echoes. Why did that connection feel so different? Why did it feel like I was understood even when I wasn't expressing everything? Why did distance not create confusion in the other person the way it usually does? These questions do not arrive as answers. They arrive as discomfort, and that discomfort slowly challenges the avoidance internal structure. Because for the first time, avoidance does not fully erase the emotional consequence. It only delays it. And in that delay, the super empath continues to exist not as a person actively engaging, but as a reflection of the avoidant cannot fully escape. Emotional A. In fact, avoidance is often misunderstood as strength, independence, or self-control, but at its core, it is usually a sophisticated survival strategy built from earlier emotional conditioning. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the regulation of feeling through distance. The avoidant individual learns, consciously or unconsciously, that emotional closeness carries risk of being overwhelmed, exposed, controlled, or hurt. So instead of learning how to process emotion, they learn how to step away from it. And over time, that stepping away becomes an identity. What makes this defense mechanism powerful in the short term is that it works. It reduces emotional intensity. It creates space when things feel too close. It gives the illusion of control in situations that feel unpredictable. But what is not visible in the beginning is the cost of that control. Because what is avoided is not resolved, it is stored. And what is stored does not disappear, it accumulates in the subconscious, waiting for effect or conditions where it can no longer be ignored. At first, emotional avoidance feels like stability. The avoidant person often appears composed, logical, even detached in a way that others may interpret as maturity. They may excel in environments where emotional neutrality is rewarded, where decision-making is valued over emotional processing. But beneath that surface-level stability, there is often an underdeveloped relationship with emotional truth. Feelings are categorized as either manageable or threatening, rather than being understood as signals that require integration. This becomes especially evident in intimate relationships. When emotional depth is introduced, the avoidance system begins to activate its protective response. It may manifest as withdrawal, distraction, rationalization, or emotional minimization. Instead of staying present with discomfort, the avoidant mind seeks exit routes, physical distance, delayed responses, changing topics, or even intellectualizing emotion. Affect L experiences so they no longer feel personal. The problem is that emotional development does not occur through avoidance. It occurs through exposure and integration. So every time the avoidant steps away from emotional depth, they also step away from emotional growth. This creates an imbalance over time. On the outside, they may function well, but on the inside, their emotional landscape remains fragmented, unprocessed, and often misunderstood even by themselves. This is why emotional avoidance eventually becomes unsustainable in deep relational dynamics. Surface-level interactions do not demand integration, but intimate bonds do. When someone begins to truly see the avoidant, not just their words, but their inconsistencies, their patterns, their emotional gaps, the system that once provided safety begins to feel threatened. Not because the other person is dangerous, but because emotional truth is being approached without the usual filters. And here is where the deeper contradiction affect RGs. The avoidant does not lack emotion, they lack emotional containment. They feel things, sometimes intensely, but without the learned skill of sitting with those emotions, they become overwhelming. So instead of processing, they suppress. Instead of expressing, they detach. Instead of staying, they leave. Each of these actions reinforces the belief that emotional distance equals safety. However, emotional reality does not operate on suppression. It operates on expression and release. So what is not expressed finds alternative pathways through anxiety, through inner restlessness, through unexplained dissatisfaction, or through repeated relational patterns that look different on the surface but feel the same internally. The avoidant may find themselves moving from one dynamic to another, believing the issue is external, when in reality, the unresolved internal pattern is being carried forward each time. Over time, this creates a subtle internal conflict. The avoidant begins to notice that temporary relief does not lead to lasting peace. Distance solves intensity in the moment, but it does not create emotional resolution. Silence removes conflict, but it does not create clarity. And avoidance removes discomfort, but it does not create understanding. This is where emotional avoidance begins to show its limitation. It cannot provide depth. It cannot create intimacy. It cannot sustain emotional fulfillment in relationships that require vulnerability. And while it may protect the individual from immediate emotional pain, it also protects them from emotional expansion. In relationships where emotional depth is present, especially with individuals who are highly perceptive and emotionally attuned, this pattern becomes even more apparent. The avoidant is not just avoiding emotion, they are avoiding being fully seen in their emotional truth. And being seen is exactly what they have learned to manage through distance. But avoidance has a hidden consequence. The more consistent entirely someone avoids emotional engagement, the less equipped they become to handle it. This creates a widening gap between emotional experience and emotional capacity. The feelings remain, but the ability to process them does not grow at the same rate. Eventually, emotional avoidance stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like limitation. Not all at once and not always consciously, but in moments of stillness, repetition, and relational reflection, the avoidant begins to sense that something essential is missing, not in the other person, but in their own ability to stay present with what is real. When betrayal enters the inner world of an avoidant individual, especially in a deeply emotionally charged dynamic, it does not remain a simple external action. It becomes an internal disruption that slowly reshapes how they experience themselves. On the surface, they may rationalize it, minimize it, or detach from its emotional weight. But beneath that surface, something far more complex, EMPATH, begins to unfold. Betrayal in this context is not just about breaking trust with another person, it is about fracturing the internal coherence of self-perception. The avoidant mind often operates through compartmentalization. They separate emotions from actions, consequences from intentions, and impact from responsibility when it becomes too overwhelming to hold everything at once. This allows them to function without immediate emotional collapse. However, when they betray someone who is emotionally deep, intuitive, and deeply attuned, someone who does not distort reality for comfort, the internal compartments begin to leak into one another. A super empathic connection is not experienced by the avoidant as just another relationship. Even if they try to categorize it that way, something within them resists full dismissal. That resistance is not conscious loyalty, it is emotional imprinting. The empath's presence has already touched areas of awareness that the avoidant does not typically access or maintain. So when betrayal occurs, it does not simply end the connection, it disturbs the internal architecture that was temporarily stabilized by that connection. At first, there may be a sense of relief. The avoidant may feel they have regained control, escaped emotional pressure, or removed themselves from something that was becoming too intense or revealing. But this relief is often short-lived because what they actually escaped was not the personette, was the emotional mirror that person represented. And removing the mirror does not remove the reflection that has already been internalized. Over time, this is where fragmentation begins. The avoidant starts to hold two conflicting internal realities at once. In one, they justify their actions through logic, distance, or perceived necessity. In the other, there is an unspoken awareness that something meaningful was disrupted in a way that cannot be easily repaired or redefined. These two narratives do not integrate smooth, HLY. Instead, they create a subtle but persistent form of inner dissonance. This dissonance often manifests as emotional confusion that is difficult to articulate. The avoidant may not label it as guilt or regret directly, because those emotions require direct acknowledgement of responsibility and impact. Instead, it appears as restlessness, intrusive recollection, or moments of emotional pause where the mind briefly revisits the connection without the usual defenses in place. In those moments, the clarity they once avoided begins to return without invitation. What intensifies this experience is the nature of the person they betrayed. A super empath does not respond in ways that reinforce avoidance. They do not typically engage in chaotic retaliation or emotional manipulation that would allow the avoidant to externalize blame. Instead, their response often involves withdrawal, clarity, and emotional detachment rooted in self-preservation rather than reaction. This absence of emotional house removes the avoidant's usual escape mechanism. Without external chaos to justify internal distance, the avoidant is left alone with the internal consequences of their actions. And this is where delayed emotional processing begins. The psyche starts to replay moments not to punish, but to understand. However, because the avoidant is not accustomed to staying with emotional truth for extended periods, these internal reflections feel destabilizing rather than clarifying. There is also a deeper psychological layer at play. Betrayal against a deeply perceptive individual often activates a hidden awareness within the avoidant that they were not misunderstood, they were fully seen. And being fully seen carries weight. It means that even their inconsistencies, hesitations, and emotional defenses were perceived without distortion. When such a person is betrayed, the avoidant does not only lose the relationship, they lose the stabilizing effect of being accurately reflected without judgment. In fact, as time progresses, this loss does not remain abstract. It begins to surface in emotional echoes. Certain memories become charged. Certain thoughts return without invitation. The mind reprocesses interactions not to change the past, but to integrate what was previously bypassed. This can create a feeling of internal looping where the same emotional themes resurface in different contexts without resolution. The avoidant may attempt to move forward by engaging in new distractions, relationships, or emotional distancing strategies. Yet the unresolved internal fragmentation remains embedded. This is because the betrayal did not occur in isolation, it occurred in a relational field that activated deeper emotional awareness than the avoidant typically sustains. So even when external circumstances change, the internal pattern persists. What makes this experience particularly destabilizing is that it challenges the avoidance core coping mechanism, emotional separation. They can separate from, affect people, environments, and situations, but separating from internal awareness is not sustainable in the same way. The emotional imprint of betrayal remains within the psyche, waiting for moments of stillness to surface again. And in those moments, the avoidant is confronted not by the person they betrayed, but by the version of themselves that existed within that connection, more exposed, more seen, and more emotionally accountable than their usual state allows. What the avoidant suppresses does not disappear, because the emotional system of a human being is not built for deletion, it is built for storage, processing, and integration. When something is too intense, too vulnerable, or too exposing for the avoidant psyche to handle in the moment, it gets pushed downward into layers of awareness that are not immediately accessible. But suppression is not resolution, it is postponement. And what is postponed does not lose its weight, it simply changes where and how it is carried. In the Beji effect ending, suppression feels like relief. The avoidant experiences a drop in emotional intensity after disconnecting from something overwhelming. There is a sense of regained control, a return to familiar emotional distance, and a quieting of internal noise. This is why suppression becomes reinforced as a strategy. The nervous system associates emotional withdrawal with safety. But what the system does not immediately recognize is that safety in the short term can become stagnation in the long term. The suppressed emotional material does not vanish. It enters a kind of internal storage where it remains active beneath conscious awareness. It may not be directly felt, but it continues to influence perception, reaction patterns, and emotional availability. Over time, this creates an internal layering effect, where present experiences are subtly shaped by unresolved past experiences that have never been fully processed. One of the most common manifestations of suppression is emotional displacement. Effect meant. Feelings that were never fully acknowledged in their original context begin to appear in unrelated situations. A conversation that feels slightly uncomfortable may trigger an emotional reaction that seems disproportionate. A moment of silence may feel heavier than it logically should. These are not random reactions, they are echoes of suppressed emotional states finding indirect expression. The avoidant often misinterprets these experiences. Because they are not consciously linked to their origin, they appear confusing, irrational, or even intrusive. As a result, the natural instinct is to suppress them again, creating a repeating cycle. Suppression leads to resurfacing, resurfacing leads to discomfort, and discomfort leads to deeper suppression. This cycle does not resolve the underlying emotional content, it only reinforces the avoidant's belief that emotional engagement is something to be avoided rather than understood. Over time, suppression begins to shape identity. The avoidant may start to define themselves as someone who is fine without emotional depth, or better alone, or more rational than emotional. These identities are not necessarily false, but they are incomplete. They are constructed around what is avoided, not what is fully integrated. And anything built on avoidance will always have structural gaps beneath the surface. One of the deeper effects of long-term suppression is emotional flattening. This does not mean the absence of emotion, but rather a reduced range of emotional accessibility. Certain feelings become harder to reach, not because they are gone, but because pathways to them have been repeatedly blocked. Joy may feel muted. Sadness may feel distant. Even love may feel abstract rather than embodied. The emotional system remains intact, but its expression becomes constrained. Yet, suppressed emotions do not remain dormant forever. They often resurface in indirect and unexpected ways. Memories return at unusual moments. Dreams carry emotional themes that were never consciously addressed. Certain people or situations trigger emotional responses that feel disproportionate to the present context. These are not signs of instability, they are signs of unresolved emotional material seeking completion. The avoidant may try to manage this resurfacing through further distancing, intellectualization, or distraction. They may analyze emotions instead of feeling them, or shift focus to external productivity to avoid internal discomfort. While these strategies can be effective in maintaining short-term stability, they do not change the underlying dynamic. The suppressed content remains, continuing its quiet influence beneath the surface of awareness. What makes suppression particularly complex is that it often coexists with functioning success. A person can appear stable, capable, and even emotionally unaffected while carrying significant unresolved internal material. This duality creates a disconnect between external present, affect ion, and internal experience. The outside world sees coherence, while the inner world experiences fragmentation. As time progresses, the weight of what is suppressed can begin to manifest as emotional fatigue, not necessarily in the form of breakdown, but as a subtle depletion of emotional responsiveness. Situations that once evoked natural engagement may begin to feel distant or effortful. Emotional connection may require more conscious effort than it once did. This is not because capacity is lost, but because access has been layered over by years of avoidance. Eventually, suppression reveals its limitation. It cannot continue indefinitely without cost. The emotional system continually seeks balance, and when expression is consistently blocked, the pressure does not disappear, it redistributes. It may appear as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or a quiet sense that something unresolved remains just beneath awareness, waiting to be acknowledged. And in that space, what was once suppressed, in fact, begins to ask not for escape but for understanding. Without self-awareness and emotional integration, recovery becomes a surface process rather than a true transformation. It may look like moving on, changing environments, entering new relationships, or convincing oneself that the past no longer holds significance. But beneath these external adjustments, the internal system remains unchanged. And when the internal system remains unchanged, repetition becomes inevitable, even if the external circumstances appear different. Self-awareness is not simply the recognition of one's actions. It is the ability to sit with the emotional truth behind those actions without immediately escaping into justification or distraction. For the avoidant individual, this is often the most difficult threshold to cross. Because awareness alone is not comfortable, it brings responsibility, memory, and emotional consequence into direct focus. And without the ability to stay present with that discomfort, aware. Affect SS is often avoided just as much as emotion itself. Integration, on the other hand, is what transforms awareness into healing. It is the process of allowing fragmented emotional experiences to be fully acknowledged, felt, and understood within the self, rather than pushed away or compartmentalized. Without integration, emotional experiences remain isolated events in memory, rather than becoming part of a coherent internal narrative. And when experiences are not integrated, they continue to influence behavior from behind the scenes. The avoidant may attempt recovery through external means. Time, distance, new connections, or intellectual reframing may be used to create the impression of progress. And to some extent, these strategies can reduce immediate emotional intensity. But reduction of intensity is not the same as resolution. The emotional imprint of unresolved experiences does not dissolve simply because attention is redirected elsewhere. True recovery requires the willingness to affect a visit emotional discomfort without the immediate urge to escape it. This means revisiting moments of betrayal, disconnection, loss, or emotional overwhelm, not to relive them, but to reprocess them with a level of presence that was previously unavailable. For someone with avoidant tendencies, this can feel counterintuitive because their entire system has been trained to associate emotional intensity with danger rather than growth. As a result, without integration, the avoidant often develops a pattern of emotional cycling. They move forward externally, but internally they remain anchored to unresolved emotional material. This can manifest as recurring relational patterns where similar dynamics appear in different forms. Different people, different contexts, but similar emotional outcomes. This repetition is not random, it is the psyche attempting to recreate conditions where unresolved material can finally be addressed. However, without self-awareness, these repetitions are often misinterpreted. The avoidant may attribute them to external factors, bad timing, incompatible partners, or changing circumstances without recognizing the internal continuity that connects them. This externalization prevents true understanding because the source of the pattern is continuously projected outward rather than examined inward. Emotional integration requires a level of inner stillness that avoidant individuals often struggle to maintain. Stillness removes distraction, and without distraction, suppressed material begins to surface. This is why avoidance and constant activity often coexist. Movement, whether physical, social, or mental, serves as a buffer against internal emergence. But healing does not occur in movement alone, it occurs in moments where movement stops and awareness remains. Without this integration process, the avoidant may experience what feels like emotional stagnation over time. Life continues, decisions are made, relationships begin and end, but something with affect remains unchanged. There is a subtle sense of repetition, as though the same emotional lesson is being approached but never fully entered. This creates an internal gap between experience and understanding. Another consequence of lacking integration is emotional misinterpretation. Feelings that arise in the present moment may be wrongly attributed to current situations, when in reality they are echoes of unresolved past experiences. This can lead to overreactions, emotional withdrawal, or confusion about why certain situations feel disproportionately intense. Without awareness of internal emotional continuity, the present becomes burdened with unresolved history. Over time, this can create a sense of emotional disconnection not only from others, but from the self. The avoidant may begin to feel that they do not fully understand their own reactions, desires, or emotional responses. This lack of internal clarity can lead to further distancing, reinforcing the cycle of avoidance rather than breaking it. Recovery in its true form requires the willingness to bridge this gap. It requires recognizing that emotional experiences are not isolated events to be escaped, but interconnected signals pointing toward deeper understanding. Without this recognition, healing remains incomplete, and the avoidant remains in a state of partial awareness functioning externally, but unresolved internally. And in that unresolved space, life continues to repeat what has not yet been fully understood. In the end, the real journey is not about labeling others as avoidant or empath, but about understanding the deeper emotional truth that everything unresolved eventually returns to be felt, understood, and integrated. What is avoided in the heart does not disappear from life. It reappears in patterns, silence, and inner restlessness until awareness finally meets it with honesty. True healing begins the moment someone chooses presence over escape, reflection over denial, and emotional responsibility. Affectivity over distance. Thank you for being present with these words, for allowing this message to reach your inner space with openness and awareness. May you carry its wisdom forward with clarity, and goodbye for now.